You can see him, but it's too late to take back what you said. And I hope you find this more comfortable. It looks like maybe a little too comfortable. I mean, don't worry about you falling asleep now. Those are pretty nice looking chairs. So, yeah, this is going to largely be a discussion. I'm going to talk to Julien a little, and then we're going to open that up to those of you who have questions. But I am going to preface the dialogue with Julien with a few words to kind of set the stage. And I'm going to preface the stage setting with just a little burst of self-promotion. This is the book that's coming out in August. These are the bound galleys, technically, not the book. It's called Why Buddhism is True, which I'm a little nervous about. That's kind of a grandiose and audacious title, and you can imagine people looking for ways to show that you failed to show that Buddhism is true. So I wanted to start out by getting a little clear on what I mean by that and what the connection of that is to mindfulness, which is the main thing I think we're going to talk about tonight. Those of you who know much about Buddhism, the first question you might ask about a book called Why Buddhism is True is like, which Buddhism do you mean? I mean, after all, there are lots of different Buddhist traditions. It's like a lot of philosophical or religious traditions. There's lots of Christianities. And I'd say in Buddhism, there's a particularly rich variety of traditions. They say different things. Some of the things contradict one another. So it can't be the case that everything that's said in every kind of Buddhism is true. But there are some kind of core ideas that are common to the major Buddhist traditions. And by the way, I'm talking about what you might call the philosophical or naturalistic part of Buddhism, not the religious part. So we're not getting into reincarnation or things like that. I'm talking more about the claims that Buddhism makes about the human predicament, the situation we find ourselves in, and how to handle the human predicament, how we should all live. So if you ask, what is the claim that's common to the different Buddhist traditions, I would say at the most general and basic level, it is this. It's that we humans tend not to see the world clearly. This makes us suffer, and it also makes us make other people suffer. So according to Buddhism, pretty much all the world's problems are caused by our just not seeing things clearly. Okay? And I'm certainly not the first person to say I think they're right about this. But, people have been saying it for 2,500 years. But I do have the advantage of having a new vantage point to look at this from, which is largely the vantage point of evolutionary psychology, which has only been around in any kind of mature form for 30 or 40 years. And evolutionary psychology is basically just the idea of taking seriously the idea that we were created by natural selection, by the process of evolution, and asking how did that shape the brain? How did that shape the mind? How did that shape the way we see things, the way we react to things? And of course, Darwin, the theory of natural selection has been around since the 19th century, but modern evolutionary psychology is only a few decades old. My book, The Moral Animal, which David referred to, is about evolutionary psychology, and it was written kind of near the dawn of it. I would say it was quite a while ago. And the connection between the basic connection between evolutionary psychology and Buddhism is that, according to evolutionary psychology, natural selection did not design the mind to see the world clearly. That might seem counterintuitive. You'd expect, natural selection, it's supposed to create these very fit organisms that are very effective in the world, and they are effective in at least one sense, which is that organisms are designed by natural selection to get genes into the next generation. But strictly speaking, that's all they are designed. Okay? So if it so happens that they can do that more effectively by not seeing the world clearly, or by, in a sense, deluding themselves about the world, or deluding themselves about themselves, then you would expect natural selection to favor that tendency toward a kind of delusion, if that delusion helps get genes into the next generation. Okay? So, I mean, you know, kind of obvious, famous examples are kind of so-called false positives, right? Like, if you're taking a hike and you've heard that there are rattlesnakes around, and you know that someone was bitten recently and died, you're going to be inclined to see rattlesnakes where they don't exist. You're going to hear noises and you're going to think that's a snake. You will briefly think that's a, you know, you may even see a lizard and it may look like a snake. Well, that kind of overreaction is built in, right? Because you're better off overreacting and being wrong 99 times out of 100 than just not paying enough attention and being bit and died. So that's a trivial example. And the examples that pertain to Buddhism tend to be much subtler, but that's the basic idea, is that the mind isn't designed to always see the world clearly. The other thing the mind is not designed to do is make us happy. You may have noticed that when you get something you want, like junk food, any kind of thrill, sex, a promotion, a good grade, whatever, the thrill wears off after a while, right? And evolutionary psychologists think that we know why the thrill wears off. It's that if it didn't wear off, you would quit trying, right? I mean, if the bliss from eating food lasted forever, you would never get hungry, you'd die, okay? So, two things natural selection did not design us to do are see the world clearly necessarily. I mean, in many ways we do. I want to emphasize that. In many ways we're really good at seeing things clearly, but we're not necessarily designed to do that. And we're not designed to be enduringly happy, although we are designed to be capable of happiness and to pursue it and to get it for a while. So you can see a kind of connection to Buddhism with its claim that we don't see the world clearly and that's why we suffer. That's why we are not enduringly happy. Now, I would say before I get into mindfulness, the argument I make in the book about, in defense of Buddhist philosophy, goes beyond the general claim that we don't see the world clearly. Buddhism makes many traditions of Buddhism put the claim more dramatically. They say we actually live in a world of delusion. You know, some of our misperceptions qualify as out and out delusions. And there are two of these, delusions, illusions, misperceptions, whatever, that are, I would say, the most fundamental, well, two very fundamental ones are these. One is the so-called not self idea in Buddhism. And that is the idea that your sense that that there is a self in here that's running the show is in some sense an illusion. That's one of Buddhism's claims. And then another claim is so-called emptiness. Sunyata is the term in Pali or Sanskrit. And that's the idea that the things out there in the world are, in some sense, most Buddhist traditions don't go full-on Matrix on you, you know. They're not saying that it's all an illusion like in the movie The Matrix. Most traditions don't. There are traditions that do, but most don't. But they do say that things are, in a sense, not as substantial as they seem, and that we naturally perceive a kind of essence to things that really isn't there, that we're really imposing on them. Now, that's a very subtle idea. I don't really plan to get into that much tonight unless somebody's curious, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of Buddhist ideas I'm defending in the book. Now, as for mindfulness, you know, Buddhism isn't just about a diagnosis, the diagnosis that we suffer because we don't see the world clearly. There's also a prescription. There's a cure. And this is laid out in the Buddha's famous first sermon, where he lays out the so-called Four Noble Truths. His first sermon after his enlightenment. He meditates for a long time, he becomes enlightened, or awakened would be a more literal translation of the term that's translated as enlightened. And then he gives this sermon, lays out the Four Noble Truths. He basically, you know, he doesn't put it exactly like I've put it, but in the interest of saving time, I won't go into too much detail. I will say, though, that The fourth noble truth says there is a path to deliverance from the human condition. So our tendency to suffer can be surmounted, according to the fourth noble truth, by following what's called the eightfold path. Okay, so the fourth noble truth points to the eightfold path. And there are these 8 things that you're supposed to do. And one of them is mindfulness. One of them is the word that's been translated as mindfulness. Could have been translated other ways, but we've come to know it as mindfulness. The eight noble truths are, a lot of them are just like so-called right view, kind of understanding the situation. Right speech is a prescription for how we should speak. We shouldn't say nasty things about people and so on. There's a lot of those that are kind of, they're either moral guidance or about comprehension, but the final 2 steps both point to meditation. One of them is concentration, and one of them is mindfulness. And so mindfulness really is deeply built into Buddhism from the very beginning. The term is there at the very core of Buddhism, and it's a fundamental part of the prescription for getting over the problem of suffering. Now, you fast forward 2,500 years, and it seems like mindfulness is everywhere. I mean, increasingly, at least. People say they do various kinds of mindfulness meditation. Some of them make it sound spiritual. They go off on meditation retreats, and I did a bunch of those in researching the book, and also just for my own edification. And then for some people, they talk about it as a more therapeutic thing, so-called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which doesn't involve any connection to Buddhism at a conscious level. I mean, you just go in and do it like a therapy, basically. And then there are people who say they're being mindful without meditating. You don't have to meditate. You can eat mindfully. You can brush your teeth mindfully. You can sleep well. It's hard to sleep mindfully. It's not impossible, but it's hard. But so it's being used in a lot of ways. It's often equated with kind of living in the moment, being very aware and appreciating the moment, stopping and smelling the roses. But the word is common in a way it certainly wasn't 30 years ago, when you basically never heard it, unless you were among a select few. I tell you that because most of you are so young that you may have heard the term mindfulness at a pretty young age, but it's actually a fairly recent growth. Now, this has led to a certain amount of kind of blowback. The way the term, you hear some complaints about mindfulness and the way it's being used from 2 kinds of people. One is serious Buddhist thinkers who think the term is just being used too loosely by people who don't really understand its roots. And then the other people who complain about this mindfulness craze are people who don't know anything about Buddhism. They're just sick of hearing the term. They're sick of people they know telling them they have to live in the moment and stop and smell the roses and so on. So you hear, and it just sounds new agey and mushy, and so a lot of them aren't enthusiastic about it. Well, they're not enthusiastic about the whole idea or the way it's being used. The people who come from the Buddhist tradition just a little unhappy with the way the term's being used. So, the question becomes, well, how should the term be used? From a Buddhist standpoint, how should the term be used? Is it being used correctly? Are these people who say they're doing mindfulness really doing mindfulness in a way that's true to Buddhist tradition? Well, one way to find out is to look at the fundamental text. There is a text, Buddhist text, Buddhist scripture consists in large measure of these things called sutras, discourses, things the Buddha said, sermons, discourses. And there's a famous one that's usually rendered as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Very, very, very old text. It's attributed to the Buddha. In truth, we don't know for sure which of the texts attributed to the Buddha should be attributed to the Buddha. I mean, speaking from outside the Buddhist tradition, that is, Buddhists, just as Christians believe that everything in the New Testament attributed to Jesus is correctly attributed, Buddhists have the same idea. But from the standpoint of critical scholarship, We're not totally sure. But anyway, this is a very old sutra, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. And it basically says, the Buddha says, here's what you do. You sit down, find a tree to sit under or something, cross your legs, and it starts off by saying, focus on your breathing. That's the first kind of instruction. And pay close attention. It says, if you've just done a long breath, think, I just did a long breath. If you've done a short breath, think, I just did a short breath. And that emphasis on very close attention, it then pervades the sutra. It's a pretty long sutra. And it goes well beyond the breath. It's like observe various parts of your body, observe your mind, your feelings, your thoughts. Observe everything, observe it very, very closely. So, this is, if you go to a major retreat center in the kind of mindfulness tradition, like I've done most of my retreats at the Insight Meditation Center in Massachusetts, which is a very well-known institution that kind of did a lot to bring a certain did a lot to bring mindfulness meditation to America. They're pretty much true to these instructions. I would say, though, that a lot of the way we talk about mindfulness now, you won't find in that original, the so-called Satipatthana Sutta or Sutra, you won't find any instruction to live in the moment. There is no phrase in the whole thing that can be translated as in the moment, now, present, nothing. At the same time, if you follow the instructions and closely pay attention to what's going on, you will be in the moment, right? I mean, you just are. So in that sense, all the stuff about living in the moment is true to the text. But I would say that the fundamental takeaway from the text is just cultivate a kind of intimate self-awareness. Now, you might ask, what good does that do? And here let me talk a little about the retreats I've been on, just to give you an example of the kind of good it's supposed to do you in your everyday life. So, I was not somebody who had ever been able to meditate by just sitting down trying to do it. I'd read books, I'd follow instructions, never worked. I don't like attention, just focus does not come naturally to me. So I decided to sign up for one of these one-week meditation retreats. It was at this place, the Insight Meditation Society. So every day, first of all, you cut off from everything. I mean, if you sneak a cell phone in, you're not, but this was back in 2003 before smartphones anyway, and I didn't have a cell phone. And so cut off from any news from the outside world. You're meditating. Sitting meditation was 5.5 hours a day. Walking meditation, 5.5 hours a day. You had an hour of doing like work. And slowly it puts you in a very different frame of mind. It's very frustrating at first because I just couldn't focus. I could not focus on 5 consecutive breaths for like a day or two. The first when I first felt I'd really gotten something significant out of it, it was a morning when I had coffee and I had too much. And those of you who drink coffee may know if you drink too much coffee, you can get this like agitated feeling that you might feel in your jaw, like you're gritting your teeth and grinding your teeth, and it's really unpleasant. You're thinking, I shouldn't have had too much coffee. And I was meditating, and I was like, mad at myself for having too much coffee and so on. But then at some point, and when you have an unpleasant feeling, you kind of try to get away from it, right? That's our instinct, is to try to get away from unpleasant feelings. Well, with mindfulness, you don't run from unpleasant feelings, whether it's anxiety or anything else. You observe them. And I just felt like, well, this unpleasant feeling is still there, but it's no longer unpleasant. I just felt like I was observing it from some distance, and it was a very strange feeling to have a feeling that had been unpleasant, that was still there but was no longer unpleasant. And since then, I've had other versions of that. There have been times when, like when I had just an anxiety in my stomach, just really worked up over something, and I'd meditate and get to a point where suddenly, you're just kind of you're feeling the knot where it is, but suddenly it's just not unpleasant. It's almost like you have some distance on it. It's like viewing you feel the structure of it in your abdomen, but it's like you might as well be viewing a piece of abstract art, abstract sculpture in a museum or something. You're just indifferent to it. Now this I don't want to say this is easy to do. This is the kind of thing, overcoming unpleasant feelings that thoroughly is something that's easiest to do if you're actually on retreat or recently did a retreat, at least I am, or if you're meditating just intensively, like several hours a day. And there are people who do that. I don't have time. I meditate 30 minutes a day, so my everyday gains are more modest, but it is still the case that if I wake up in the middle of the night with anxiety, I get over it sooner than I think I would if I weren't meditating and go back to sleep. It's also the case that if you sometimes you feel a feeling bubbling up, like you're driving, some driver does something obnoxious, you feel like road rage, and you just kind of observe it, you notice it, because you've trained yourself to notice feelings rather than just surrender to them, and so you just kind of like let it go. So these kinds of gains, are gains of a certain scope are entirely realistic, I think, for a fairly modest amount of meditation. That said, being on retreat is just amazing. It can be amazing if it's like going well. It can be like you'll feel like I was meditating once. There was a guy who was falling asleep and started to snore, and your first instinct is the first instinct is you want to open your eyes and see him. And that's an interesting thing in its own right? When you think about it, when someone is doing something that annoys you, you want to find out who it is. That's an interesting fact in itself. That we're there are all kinds of things about your reactions to things that you learn through mindfulness meditation. And this is one, is like, you want to know who to be mad at, right? So you can bring him to justice at some later date or something. Once I started thinking about it, and located this spot where, when you feel, I felt aversion to the snoring, sound I don't like. And then I felt loathing for this person. And that's maybe somewhere else. But when you're on retreat, it really can be the case that when you focus on a feeling like that, it's just like hitting it with a laser. It just completely disappears immediately. My everyday life is not like that, as anyone who knows me can attest. But it is amazing. When you think about, well, what's life like for these people who devote their life to this, and when you hear about nirvana, attaining true liberation, enlightenment, nirvana. I don't know how many, if any, people have done that in the most thoroughgoing sense of the word, but when you're on retreat for a long period of time, you start to see how you could get way closer to that than we are. So, just to kind summarize what the point of self-awareness, this self-awareness is, what the point of mindfulness is. Again, it isn't put this way in the ancient text, but I would say it is to become very aware of how your whole system works, your mind, your body, what kinds of things influence your mind, your feelings, and your behavior. And through that awareness, start to liberate yourself from these influences that are constantly impinging on you. You come to realize how just thoroughly reactive we are. You see something, you react to it without thinking, and you just become more aware of that, and you can get some measure of liberation from the control that is kind of inflicted on us by our environment, you might say. That's pretty much it. The one other thing I'd say before we start the discussion is that a big emphasis in my book, and I think this is sometimes explicit in the Buddhist text, more often implicit, but I do think it's a valid takeaway from Buddhist thought, is that much more than we realize it, our cognition is shaped by feeling, by affect. Psychologists used to talk, like cognitive stuff and affective stuff. There's feelings and there's thoughts. More and more, for decades now, psychologists, I think, have converged on the view that actually the two are much more finely intertwined than you might have thought. And let me just give you one example, which is, like I said, I think I qualify as having attention deficit disorder. And if you pay really close attention, you know, it's easy to think of that as just like, well, there's this thing called attention and I don't have it and some people do. But if you pay attention to distraction, you'll find that that's actually an affective problem. It's a feeling. Like, if I'm writing something and I can't focus on it, there's one of two things going on in maybe both. One is that I get to a difficult part of it, and it's like I start feeling like I don't want to confront it. The text, the thing I'm writing starts to have this aversive impact on me. I don't want to deal with it. And suddenly, something will pop up that I feel good about thinking about, right? And it's a feeling. It's like, oh, maybe I could research like smartphones online. I actually like that, whether I need a smartphone or not. I just like to do it. I like to do it because it feels good, you know? If you pay close enough attention. So even attention deficit disorder, which you think of as a cognitive thing, I think it's totally an affective thing. And it's a small example, but I do think one thing you become aware of through mindfulness is that the way the environment pushes and pulls you into doing various things, and the way people, whether they mean to or not, push you and pull you into doing different things. You know, in other words, just the sight of a person with you go in a certain direction. The medium is feelings, it's affect. You react to things, however subtly, with an affect that then shapes your cognition, shapes your thoughts. So if you want to be as free as possible, you really want to become attentive, I think, to affect. And I think I can stop there, and Julien, you can interrogate me.
Hold on. So let's just give a quick...
You can claim there was a standing ovation, whether or not there was. Like the CIA, the speech in front of the CIA, where he said, they gave me 5 minutes standing ovation. If you looked at the videotape, they were standing through the whole thing. They were already standing. So that doesn't qualify as a standing ovation.
That didn't qualify, but it just struck me as sort of funny that you can just ask for a standing ovation.
You can.
But also, these chairs are too comfortable.
Yeah, you don't.
So I wanted to,
That was good. That was good.
Yeah. So thank you very much. That was really fascinating. So I think there's several directions we can go. And I'm going to give our next speaker a little bit of latitude on that, but I'm going to feed a suggestion, like an improv, you know. So first, let me introduce Dr. Julien Musolino. He's a professor of cognitive science and psychology here at Rutgers, incredibly brilliant and productive, and he's beginning to turn his attention from linguistics to the cognitive science of religion. And so we have fantastic conversations at a bar in Philadelphia every now and again, so I'm happy to call Julien my friend. And I don't know why I said that you remind me of like a modern Emerson, but I was like, why did I say that? But the more I was thinking about it, I buy it. Like, I think that works. And so I was thinking, what would I do for Julien? And I think it would be a younger, more debonair Chomsky. You know, he's got the linguistic aspect. You know, he does some political work. Anyway, Julien's a great friend of the humanist community here at Rutgers. We met when he was supporting his last book, The Soul Fallacy, and he donated his time to the group. We're really grateful for that. And Julien's writing a new book on the history of reason, the rational ape, so something to look out for. And so, can you give a hand to Julien? Yeah. All right. So here's my suggestion. You don't have to take it. So this is where it gets fun. And this comes partly from my reaction. So part of my reaction to what you said was that was eminently sensible. It seems as if what you were talking about sort of stripped out the aspects of Buddhism that sort of a secular humanist like I know Julien would object to, and you kept some of the interesting pieces that seemed helpful. And I appreciate you talking about your retreat experience. I think that's helpful to cue the intuitions about how much this can be helpful. And there's evidence supporting this. You know, So my question for Julien to sort of muse about, if he so wishes, he may have his own things to talk about, is how would a contemporary secular humanist worldview informed by modern cognitive science differ from that account of Buddhism, if at all? And maybe some studies have come to mind or some evidence that you might want to talk about. So that's just a suggestion. Feel free to go your own way. Sure. But I'll give it to you.
Do I get to stand behind the table? Did you want to switch seats maybe?
Sure.
Does that work? Yeah? Okay. Here. Water. Get to guard my precious briefcase.
The Academy Award close?
So thank you very much, David, for this very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's always a pleasure to attend events like this one. I also want to thank you. Is it a subtle suggestion?
Mention it every other sentence.
Sounds good. And it's a pleasure to meet Robert Wright, who I've never met before. I read The Moral Animal many years ago, and I was very impressed by it. I went on to read many more books. And I went to look the number of things you've done on the web online. I recently posted a 60-second sermon for you, which was really fun to do. You can watch it on Robert's channel. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to a conversation on this wonderful topic. So I must say that this is a rather unusual exercise for me because until about 10 minutes ago, I had no idea what I was going to say because I had no idea what Robert was going to say. So what I would say now in response to David's question about how a secular humanist would view the kind of ideas that Robert just discussed is, I would say that I'm very sympathetic to the entire set of ideas. I'm very sympathetic about the initial attempt at separating naturalistic claims taken from Buddhism from the supernatural. I'm not very sympathetic to the supernatural. And I think that there's something really importantly true about the idea that the mind was not designed by natural selection for us to see things the way they really are, or to see things clearly. I mean, this emerged in the tradition that Robert mentioned, but it's also a very important aspect of the scientific worldview. In fact, I'll mention a few people over time that have made a similar point. So if you go back to the 17th century, and take someone like Francis Bacon, who was one of the fathers of modern science. He wrote in 1620 a book with a Latin title called The New Organ, in which he talked about idols of the mind. Idols of the mind were essentially biases that prevented us from seeing the world the way it really is. So he had this metaphor of a glass of water, and he said that our minds do not give us true reflections of how the world is, but distorted ones. And then he went on to say that the way to the way to get out of that is a little different from meditation and the kinds of ideas that you heard Robert talk about. The way to get away from this and the way to get a better understanding of how the world works back then was to espouse a new set of ideas that were being developed in the late 16th, early 17th century that came to be known as the science or the scientific method. This was echoed several centuries later by another great scientist, Richard Feynman, the famed physicist, Nobel laureate, who has a principle named after him called the first principle. And the first principle, Feynman tells us, is that we must not fool ourselves, and we're the easiest people to fool. And he was, in a sense, echoing words that Bacon warned us about in his book. So I'll just add a few comments about this. So there are many students in my current class here. I'm teaching a class called Religious Mind, which is an introduction to the cognitive science of religion. And so one thing I think that we've discovered in a few hundred years of science is that the intuitions that we have about how the world works, whether it be the world of motion or the world, what now, say, physicists study, or the world of the living, like what biologists study, or the mental world, what psychologists study. So we have very good experimental evidence from various fields that these intuitions are really at odds with what science has discovered. So to give a few examples, it seems that what's called intuitive physics, or the intuitions that we have about how the physical world essentially Aristotelian. So Aristotle developed the whole system, as you know, a few thousand years ago, which is very different from the system that we have now in modern science. Likewise for biology, we have our intuitions are not along the lines of Darwinian thinking. They're more along the lines of creationism or intelligent design. In the case of psychology, our intuitions are dualistic in a Cartesian sense. And what you find is that in any area where we've made significant progress, what we've seen through science is that scientific theories depart radically from these intuitions. So physics is no longer Aristotelian. There's no impetus, there's just inertia. Biology is not essentialistic or creationistic. It's based on Darwin's ideas that Robert talked about. Psychology is not dualistic, it's materialistic, which makes it difficult to teach these ideas, and you find in a country like the US that there's a lot of resistance to certain scientific ideas, in particular Darwin's ideas. In part for those reasons. I mean, there are other factors, of course, but that's one factor. Let's see what else. I think that I'm very sympathetic too to we just heard a wonderful guest lecture in my course by David on spiritual experiences and mindfulness. I can't say it's something that I've tried myself. I think I'm like Robert. I tried a few times to get the meditation tape, and didn't really work well for me. But I do other things that provide me with comfort and relaxation. I do a lot of sports. I also have tenure, which makes you very relaxed when you're in a university setting. Not too anxious, that many things. I have a rather privileged life, and I'm aware of it. Let's see. One more thing that Robert mentioned that I think is right on the money is this idea that this distinction, perhaps maybe a Cartesian distinction, that there's this sort of reason on the one hand, mind, and then that you have feelings and emotions, and they're sort of separate. There's a great book that I'm sure you know of by DiMaggio called Descartes' Error, which speaks to this and says, well, the two systems are much more intertwined than you think. And modern psychology has now shown that we make often the distinction between what we call system 1 and system 2. So system 1, very, very roughly, is sort of the hidden tip of the iceberg. It's all the forces that lurk in your unconscious and have some pull in the decisions you make and the things you do. And system 2, which is the sort of the conscious part where you can think about the nature of your thoughts and experiences. And we now know that the two are very intimately intertwined, and that a lot of what emerges from system 1, we get feelings, intuitions. We don't really know why they are the way they are or what mechanisms lead to them, but that's what we have as to reflect upon as conscious beings. And that's what leads to, eventually, science and also religion. So let's see. I guess I'm going to stop here too, right? Because I'd like to have a conversation. So I'm looking forward to, if you want to switch seats again.
Oh, you're
sit
right.
here. So,
Yeah,
okay, wonderful.
I'll mutually
Yeah,
interrogate.
sounds
Unless you had any direct response, I had a sort of a second layer to Julian's question.
You know, the one thing that I thought I should throw out is that I don't want to make mindfulness and even the sheerly naturalistic part of Buddhism sound too, I don't know if the word is secular, or too strictly therapeutic. I mean, there are deep philosophical questions that, in particular, I'm thinking about the relationship between consciousness and the physical being that are unresolved, and serious meditation can alter your perspective on those. And if you ask, like, what would it be like if I went really whole hog, months and months on retreat and so on, the hope would be that actually your ideas about the nature of consciousness might change. And I've gotten a little taste of this myself on retreat, but I've also talked to very, very serious meditators and heard the kinds of things they say. And so I won't, right now I guess I won't get into this in any more depth, except to say that I just don't want to make the whole thing sound too superficial and therapeutic, because there are real depths you can go to that I think don't involve getting supernatural. They just involve getting into legitimate but deep philosophical speculation.
So I'm going to go right there.
You're going to get back to our conversation on the car?
Well, maybe we'll see. So I think that's a really important point. The first one, though, Julian, you mentioned System 1 and System 2, and Robert, you mentioned some evidence from psychotherapeutic contexts that provide some support that mindfulness might lessen cognitive biases in a therapeutic context. But it strikes me that we might be birthing a study here, but it occurs to me, I wonder if mindfulness has ever been tested as a way to actually fall into less of the System 1 traps. In other words, to make people think more analytically and less intuitively in the Kahneman Tversky sense. That seems like a very straightforward test, and it'd be kind of a fun study to run. So I think we should do that. But let's go into these deeper ideas about the nature of consciousness. We also know that when we have people meditate for a while, there's a number of changes. Some of them you mentioned, attentional, emotional, but we also know their beliefs change in a pretty systematic way. They're more willing to endorse more spiritual beliefs. So there might be this clarifying aspect of mindfulness. Maybe it makes people think more analytically and more self-regulation, etc. But depending on your metaphysical beliefs, there could be a component of meditation that adds a distorting lens in the sense that people become more spiritual. So I wanted to put that to you and maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit more about what you mean about the people you talked to who have talked about their view of consciousness changing a little bit.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, of course, different people mean different things by spiritual, but let me say a couple of things that touch on what I mean by spiritual, I guess. And actually, there's two different things that have been brought up here. One is cognitive biases, and then one is kind of deep philosophical / spiritual questions about consciousness or so on. And there's, in a way, they exist more on a continuum than you might think. And here's what I mean by that. And when you talk about cognitive biases, there are some that I consider basically trivial and kind of interesting, but not that consequential. So, for example, I forget what this one is called, but people will drive all the way across town to save $100 on a smartphone. They won't go to that much trouble to save $100 like on a car, right? When you think about it, the question should be how many hours is $100 worth, right? But that's not the way we do it, because we're for whatever reason, our minds are kind of warped in this particular case, and we take into account the overall price of the object in a way that doesn't make sense. I call that a trivial cognitive bias. Now here's what I would call a much more important cognitive bias that leads to wars and massive suffering and atrocities. And it's not very well known, actually, I think. A well-known cognitive bias that is also responsible for wars is just confirmation bias, right? Once you believe something, like once you believe your country is right, you will only pay attention to the evidence that supports that view, and you will ignore evidence that's contrary to it. So that's confirmation bias, and that has huge consequences. That's important. But there's a subtler one that I think is very interesting, and it has to do with what's called attribution error. Now, the original version of attribution error, which has since been modified, as I'll explain, was this: that when we see someone do something, and we're explaining, like, why do they do it, we overemphasize their internal disposition. In other words, what kind of person they are. And we underemphasize environment. So if you're at a checkout stand at a CVS and the person in front of you is being a jerk, you think, oh, a jerk, right? And you would say, if somebody asks you what kind of person, they'd say, oh, well, that's a jerk. It's just the kind of person they are. Whereas for all you know, they just found out they had a terminal disease or some other, you just don't know. But our tendency is to over-attribute to disposition and not enough to circumstance or situation. that was the original idea of the fundamental attribution error. Now, it turns out it's a little more complicated than that. With your friends and allies, it works like this. If they do good things, you tend to attribute it to the kind of person they are. If they do bad things, you explain it away by circumstance. You see this especially with like our offspring. Like, if my daughter's misbehaving on the playground, they're old enough so that they no longer misbehave on the playground, she misbehave in other arenas, but if it's my daughter misbehaving on the playground, it's not because she's a bad girl, she can get her nap or whatever, but if the other kid misbehaves, especially if it's like a rival of your daughter's or something, well, that's the kind of person they are, okay? Whereas if your daughter does something good, well, of course, that's the kind of person she is, and so on. The rival does something good, you go, oh, they're just showing off or whatever. Now, so this becomes very important. Like, you may have noticed when a country's approaching war and some people are arguing for the war, the first thing they try to do is demonize the lead, to convince you that the leader of the other country is bad. Because then, once you've got the person in that frame, then anything they do that's seemingly good, you'll explain away. They're just faking it, they're showing off. But anything they do that's bad will reinforce the image as an enemy. So this is a really important cognitive bias. And it gets to this idea of emptiness that I mentioned. The Buddhist idea of emptiness is that things have less in the way of essence than we think. Now that would take a long time to explain if I was talking about plants and couches, although I think it applies to that. But when we're talking about people, you might know what I mean, right? Like, if it's an enemy, you get a kind of, that person gives off a different kind of vibe. This is most obvious when, like, it's somebody you don't know who they are, and then you hear, oh, that's that person who did this horrible thing, and suddenly they're just transformed before your eyes. You now have a literally different perception of that kind of person. This fuels tribalism and so on. This idea that people have different kinds of essences, good essences, bad essences, and so on. So that's a case where I'd say that our cognitive biases, and yes, I would say that mindfulness, assiduous mindfulness, does make us less vulnerable to these kinds of perceptions and more inclined to take a more objective, measured stance toward people. And whether you want to call that a spiritual question or just a moral question is up to you. But I will say that at the other, as I said, there are experiences that might be more obviously recognized as spiritual, and one of these is what's called the not-self experience, and that can have different dimensions, but let me just mention one, and this is one I've had on retreat, is when suddenly the bounds that define yourself, the difference between you and the outside world, almost starts to dissolve. I remember being on retreat, and I had been meditating, so like 4 or 5 days into the retreat, I had a tingling in my foot, and I heard a bird singing, and I really felt that the tingling in my foot was no more a part of me than the bird singing. I mean, I just really felt it, and I know it sounds either trivial or crazy, but it didn't feel either. And people who really meditate intensively report this as just a more common experience. They don't feel as if they are separated from the rest of the world and the rest of humankind to the extent that the rest of us do. Okay? So that is, on the one hand, I would say that's on a continuum from the cognitive bias, eradicating that cognitive bias of seeing essence in people is at one end of the continuum. And then this part of the not-self experience, just feeling there's really no difference between other people and you, is at another end of the continuum, but I do think it's a continuum. And because getting to the point where you feel this kind of connection to people involves dissolving that sense of other, the sense of a kind of an essence of them that separated them from you. Maybe, I don't know how clear that is, but I would say those are two, I think you could call both of those spiritual progress or moral progress, or, but that is, but that's something.
So I think David's question or suggestion and then Robert's response really leads, I think, to a very exciting research program. Namely, how can we measure empirically, and I think that we can, the extent to which those practices have the kinds of effects that were mentioned. Now, to be devil's advocate for a second, I mean, I think it should be done. So if there are any aspiring writing students in the audience, that's a good dissertation topic. I don't know, is there a literature, Robin, on this already, or do you know?
On the effect of mindfulness on particular cognitive...
Right, on decision making, I mean, I know that there's literature on the kinds of moods and things that they put people in, but more specifically in terms of how it affects, thinking and decision making.
I mean, I will say in researching the book, I didn't pay that much attention to mindfulness studies because psychology has had these replication problems, and a lot of mindfulness studies are done by people who like mindfulness. So I didn't get that deeply into it. I know there have been, I think Josh Green at Harvard has done some brain scan studies where in terms of the nature of moral decision making, like Buddhist monks who have meditated a lot, I think the parts of the brains that light up are the parts associated with a more utilitarian approach.
That'd be good.
And less of a kind of affectively intuitive approach to moral judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. But in terms of things like even confirmation bias, I would predict that truly effective mindfulness practice does make inroads there, because you just, at the end of a retreat, at least, you just are in a more objective frame of mind. It's hard to describe. You're less judgmental of people, and you're just less inclined to rush to judgment, and you feel less attached to your ideas. I mean, a big part of Buddhism is the idea that attachment is bad, and in that original Mindfulness Sutra, there is instruction about observe the way you're like clinging to thoughts, and so on, and you're less inclined to cling to your own ideas, I think, when you're really using them.
See, what's interesting about this, I could see it go either way. So there are a lot of studies that show that what happens with system one, so the system that runs your unconscious mind and generates all kinds of biases and intuitions, we see that in people who are more analytical, those intuitions can be overridden to very often lead to the right conclusions. But so I can imagine then the practice going either way, so either giving us good results, or to the extent that it suppresses the more analytical part, then there'd be more room for these biases to do things that we would not be very happy about. So I think it would be really interesting to try to empirically get a sense of the scope of the phenomenon and to see, so you made a distinction between different types of biases, those that you thought were trivial, and I'm not saying they're trivial, but compared to those that can lead to, they don't start, right. Yeah. And I agree, I mean, back to what you said about confirmation bias, I once read a very thoughtful analysis of what happened during the Iraq War. That somehow the Bush people were convinced, perhaps sincerely, that there were all kinds of bad things there, and the data and the evidence they collected was filtered through that, and we know the consequences. Trillions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and the world is, in fact, less safe now than it was before. I'm not just making this up. Our own intelligence agencies concluded that a few years ago. But back to the main issue, it would be really interesting then to see how the different biases that we know about, and we know about plenty of them, how they are affected by those kinds of practices. Will we get a uniform effect? Would they be all dampened, or would some of them persist and others not? It would be really, really interesting to try to find out, especially if little work has been done on this topic.
Great. So thank you both. I just want to open it up for questions. I've got 1, 2, 3. We'll start there, and questions can be comments. Try to keep them somewhat short, and they can be directed at either Julien or Robert. So, sir.
Can it be an experience?
Sure.
After many years of very hard work, I'm I'm that close to nirvana. There's one barrier to that. And that is when I'm in a movie theater and somebody turns on their cell phone. I see what's going on in my stomach, in my head, particularly my stomach. By the end of the movie, I'm going out to see if I can find that person. The problem is I have a cane, so I trip people on the way to find out who did that. But it's it really is a challenge, and I'm sure that other people have other things that just bug them. But this is a special one. It reminds me of when I used to teach. I was a terror when people were using their cell phone, or it struck me that they were looking at a movie while I was talking. But that final barrier, then I will just disappear. Go away.
For me, it's elevator noises.
Yeah, speaking of psychology, mindfulness, and spirituality, I know like.
Could you stand up so we can hear?
Parapsychology.
Would you mind just people
You're
in
asking
the
you to
back?
stand up so that they can hear what
Hear
you're
your
saying.
question.
You want to stand up?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you don't
so
mind,
that they
yeah.
can hear. Maybe you should
Okay.
even face them since we won't have.
Okay,
them.
yeah,
That's a
like,
big room.
as you know, you can talk about mindfulness, psychology, and spirituality. Now, Duke University has my understanding, has a parapsychology program. Now, the reason I bring this up is it ties in a little bit, like, you're familiar with the, I guess, the out-of-body experience, or, you know, we've got depersonalization, such a technique.
Out of body.
Out of body is, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very, you know, yeah, so, I mean, what are your thoughts and reflections on that?
Sure, I'm happy to, yeah. So, well, I should stand up again. Yes, so you bring up a very interesting question. We've been talking about a range of subjective experiences, and some of those are quite radical. I have never experienced them myself, but just imagine, for example, right now you're all seeing the world, which means us here on the stage, from your first-person perspective. And you're seeing us, from our perspective, you're seeing us from a third-person perspective, right? But now imagine all of a sudden having the impression that you're seeing yourself from a third-person perspective. In other words, that somehow your consciousness, to describe it, were to leave your body and you can actually see yourself sitting there or standing here or lying in your bed. So that's typically what's called an out-of-body experience. There's no doubt that those are real. In fact, some of the first accounts of those, and there's another phenomenon called a near-death experience, which contains often an out-of-body experience. But you go back to Plato in the Republic, and you already described experiences like those. And there are studies that show that, I don't know, like 5%, I think, or something, of people in the US experience them. So these are real experiences. There's no question that people have those experiences. The key question, I think, at least for me, is how do we interpret them? So one possibility, of course, and that's been done a lot, is to say, well, look, it's your soul that temporarily leaves your body and can perceive things around and then sort of comes back. I want to say this is not the way that the majority of mainstream scientists today interpret those phenomena, right? However interesting and fascinating they are. We know also now that these phenomena can be induced by stimulating certain parts of the brain. You don't have to be near death to see them happen. There's a guy in Switzerland called Olaf Blanc who's done a lot of that research, if you're interested. Shoot me an email, I can. So the modern understanding, scientific understanding of them is that they are just fabrications of the brain. They don't correspond to anything real out there. There's no soul that comes out of the body. That the way we function is that we really construct reality, and that, of course, we don't think about it in everyday life because it all seems to very smoothly integrate. So, okay, it looks like I'm here and you're there, and it's all fine. But under certain conditions, this careful construction can come apart, and then we have very weird first-person experiences. I'll mention another one that was that's very. How many of you have heard of something called alien hand syndrome? Those who were in my class, maybe, right? Okay, so that's another case where, so imagine you wake up in the middle of the night, and this happened in Germany in the 19th century, and this woman woke up in the middle of the night because her hand, or because someone was trying to choke her, and it turns out it was her left hand. And with her right hand, she just pulled at it saying, stop, stop, stop. So the phenomenon is that you seem to, again, imagine that right now you have conscious control of your hands, right? So when I grab the bottle here, the feeling I have inside is that I'm the author of the action. I'm not surprised by my hand going right, because I wanted to do that. But in Alien Hand, you lose voluntary control of, say, your left hand. So now your left hand starts doing things that you don't want it to do. Right? So you can easily imagine how this was interpreted not too long ago. The interpretation was, look, this is possessed, the spirit in my hand, and this is terrible. Not the interpretation that's given now by mainstream modern scientists. So, yes, there's a range of very interesting, unusual experiences, but the important question is not are they real? Of course they're real. People have those experiences, but the important question is how do we interpret them? And speaking as a scientist, in mainstream science at least, the interpretations are no longer supernatural. They're naturalistic. They have to do with the brain, how it functions, et cetera, et cetera.
The Buddhism also mentions something about the out-of-body experience. That's a very portion of the text where it's like you're pulling a knife out of the sheath. That's how I describe the out-of-body experience. But I mentioned that.
Yeah, let me, I mean, there's all kinds of experiences, first of all, that you can have if you meditate for long enough. And some are more central to actual Buddhist philosophy than others. And part of a Buddhist tradition, by the way, is to be skeptical, not just of our everyday perceptions, but also of perceptions you would have after deep meditation. I mean, it's in some ways a very skeptical tradition. And I don't, as far as I know, I'm not aware of a Buddhist tradition in which an out-of-body experience per se is really considered philosophically fundamental. But there's one thing you mentioned that I think gets back to the not-self experience, which is that you talked about alien hand syndrome, right? And what that tells you is that what we define as ourself is in a sense optional. People with alien hand syndrome are defining the self as stopping somewhere before their hand. They are saying, no, this is me here, and then this part is something else. And you can also, it can also go in the other direction, which is that things that are outside of your body can seem almost like a part of you. So like when your children suffer, you feel the suffering almost as sometimes more acutely than if it were you suffering. Okay? And there's a Darwinian explanation for that, is that offspring share your genes. And so there's a sense in which, and William James wrote about this, the great psychologist William James, he said that, you know, offspring, close kin are in some sense part of yourself. He grappled with this question of like, what is the self? And so the point is just that, like, if you ask, the point is, again, to get back to philosophy, the idea that I am this discrete conscious entity whose bounds in here is not a necessary property of consciousness per se. Okay, it seems to be something that is shaped by natural selection, because for the most part it makes sense for animals, given that natural selection designs animals to take care of themselves plus kin, but to get their genes in the next generation. Just makes sense to define this zone as really super special. But that's not necessarily like a metaphysical truth, and that's part of the point of Buddhism. So that when you have the not-self experience, which by the way includes the full thoroughgoing version, but includes not just a breakdown of the sense of the boundedness of the outer self, but also less identification with the interior in a certain sense, you know, less like, oh, that emotion is really part of me, and more like, oh, it's just an emotion passing through there. But in any event, the claim, you know, like if you talk to serious meditators, one thing I've heard more than one of them say, when you say like, well, what is it like? You say like, you're not a self. What do you mean? What do you mean? And more than one of them has said to me, it feels like consciousness is like a universal field, and I am one point of access to it. And that, again, I mean, you can see why natural selection wouldn't want you to go around thinking that. If natural selection is supposed to make animals good at taking care of themselves, you'd want natural selection to think, no, this is the thing. At the same time, this possibility that it's really weirder than that consciousness is a more continuous thing, and we kind of convince ourselves that we're little discrete chunks of it, when maybe in some sense, in some metaphysical sense, we're not. That, whatever the merits of that idea, that's the kind of thing I mean when I say, you know, meditative practice is not just therapeutic. There are very deep philosophical questions that some people think can be illuminated by it. And this question of like, what are the bounds of consciousness and what is consciousness is one example.
So that, I think, I know Julian's going to want to respond to that. So I think that's the kind of, up till now, I think most of your claims about mindfulness have been pretty uncontroversial from, and even not all that different from like a contemporary secular humanist cognitive science perspective. But I think the claims by these meditators about a field of consciousness.
And that's not Buddhist doctrine, by the way. It's just an experience these people have that I wouldn't necessarily use.
Okay, but that would be a difference then, right, between the.
Right, so I wouldn't deny the fact that people have had such experiences, but I'd be rather skeptical about whether you can translate that experience into a claim that because I feel there's a field of consciousness, that there is something out there that's a field of consciousness. We talked about this at length in the car. I think that if there's one thing that science has shown us is that we have to be very careful to not project the results of our first-person perspectives and intuitions onto the world out there. So in other words, I think it goes with what you said about the self. It's not because I feel very deeply that there's this discrete entity within me that I can call a self or a soul that is distinct in some fashion from my body, and I can easily imagine it surviving it, that must be so, that there must really be something like this, right? So it could, of course, be a construction. The example I use, which is trivial, but I think makes the point, is that when we have dreams, which are very vivid very often, if I dream that there's a monster under my bed, I can't take that experience and say, well, therefore, because I felt it very passionately and very vividly, therefore there must be a monster under my bed. We have to go and check whether there's a monster under one's bed. Likewise, for the feeling that we all have now that the Earth is stationary and not in motion around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, every fiber of our being tells us that this is the case. But we know that this is not true. So given the fact that there are intuitions, perceptions that we have that are simply not true, so we think, and some are true, I mean, to some degree, we have to be very careful to not, reach beyond and say, well, I feel this way, therefore that's the way the world must look. So in the case of the field of consciousness, I have to say, and I'm not saying this is something you endorse, I mean, you're saying that there are people who feel that way. I'm skeptical about the interpretation that there is such a thing. But I'm not skeptical about the fact that people have had those experiences.
Yeah. Well, I think in favor of at least taking what they're saying seriously are a couple of things. One is just that consciousness is super weird. And I think more and more philosophers are in the camp of what you might call Mysterians, who just think we really don't have a good explanation of it. I mean, when you think about it, if you just think about natural selection, like, okay, so these molecules started replicating a few billion years ago. And then, by the logic of natural selection, the ones that are best at replicating will keep replicating. So if some have mutations that make them particularly good at replicating, they will flourish. And if one of the mutations is to encase the self-replicating molecules in a cell, that's good for survival, that will flourish. And then cells get together and form multicellular organisms, because that is adaptive in the same way, so blah, blah, blah. When you think about it, there's actually no reason to expect that at any point it would be like anything to be one of these machines. Why? What is the purpose of subjective experience when you view natural selection like this? Why should there be experience? I mean, or to put it another way, when your hand gets too close to a flame and you feel heat and you withdraw your hand, what you feel is that the feeling of heat caused you to withdraw your hand. But that's actually not the view from mainstream behavioral science. The view from mainstream behavioral science is that we can explain it all physically, which I'm sure we can, in the sense that, the heat touches your skin, that leads to physical events that go up and get your muscle to contract and so on. So you don't need subjective experience to explain this behavior. And it's not obvious why subjective experience would enter any lineage in the course of natural selection. So this is one reason that the very fact of subjective experience is I think, from my point of view, kind of mystery. It seems functionally redundant. And so that's one thing I'd say in favor of people who say something weird about consciousness and actually take it seriously. The other thing I'd say is that if these are people who are really adept meditators and have meditated for a long time, I mean, one thing it seems they've done, just in other realms, leave aside what they're saying about consciousness, is it does seem that they have liberated themselves from some of the mechanisms that natural selection built in to shape our perceptions, particularly feelings and the way feelings guide perception. And they seem to have, in some realms, gotten what you might call a more objective view of things. It's less like the view from their point of view and more like the view from nowhere, or the view from everywhere, whatever you want to call it. So I think, I mean, granted, it's very different to say, well, they're more objective in the sense of being able to see that actually something that they did to somebody was their fault. It's one thing to say meditators are better at being objective, morally objective. I grant you that's very different from saying, well, maybe their objectivity gives them a vantage point on the question of consciousness that we should pay particular attention to. But, I think it counts somewhat in favor of at least taking the speculation seriously that part of this meditative practice is to liberate yourself from the specific constraints built into our perception and cognition by natural selection.
Want to respond?
Sure,
Take a question.
Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to
It's up to you.
respond. So yes, I agree that consciousness is weird and that we do not know how it works. I want to make a distinction maybe for the students who may not be clear on exactly what we're talking about. So in the literature, there's an important distinction, a number of distinctions, but that are made when we talk about consciousness. What I think you're talking about is what philosophers call qualia, or sometimes the hard problem. And what qualia is essentially is the inherently subjective feelings that we have when we see something that is red, or we smell a particular smell. Sometimes it's called, one way to talk about this is, if there's something it is like to be me, and there is, then I have this property. So that's one sense of consciousness. There are many senses. Another sense of consciousness, which is not nearly as mysterious, is what's called access consciousness, which is to say, it's trying to understand when the stimulus is perceived unconsciously by subjects. And we know that it's perceived even though they tell you I didn't see or didn't hear anything, because their behavior tells us that they've perceived it. Their behavior would make no sense if they hadn't perceived it. And then there's a threshold that can be crossed at which the person behaves as though they had registered the stimulus and tells you, yeah, I heard the sound, or I saw the flash and I can tell you it was 43. So trying to understand what the brain mechanisms are that move stimuli from being unconscious to conscious, or how they gain access to consciousness, that's a very tractable scientific problem. And we've made a lot of progress on that. If you're interested, there's a really wonderful book by a French cognitive psychologist, I'm doing a plug for my fellow citizens there, by Stanislas Dehaene, called Consciousness and the Brain, which is the latest advances, discoveries in terms of access consciousness. Then there's the problem of qualia, okay? And yes, it is weird. And there are roughly 3 positions on that question. One is the Mysterians. People say, look, it's such a deep mystery that we'll never be able to understand what it is. There's an explanatory gap, and who knows what happens. There are people who say, yes, it's mysterious. There's another position now. Who say, yes, it's mysterious, but give us some time, give us more time to do science, and eventually we think it's within our grasp to understand it. It may take 100 or 1,000 years, but we'll get there. And then there's a third position. There are people who think it's a false problem. mean that we're just barking up the wrong tree. It's not that we don't have inner experiences, but there's just a false problem. And that it will, those people claim that it will eventually evaporate as we do more science and understand more about the brain and access consciousness and things like that. So I think the answer is we really don't know what's going on. And I'm very hesitant to draw any kind of conclusions about, so I'm very skeptical about the views that say, my intuitions tell me that it's hard to see why or how a physical system could give rise to consciousness. Well, it's hard to see how a physical system could actually yield attraction to the distance. Okay, so Newton was very bothered by that, his own discovery. If you read what he said about it, he said it makes no sense, it's absurd. Okay, it's absurd because it's counterintuitive. Newton's physics came to replace the Cartesian physics, the kind of contact mechanics that Descartes developed. So contact mechanics was intuitive. We understood intuitively what was going on. Newton shattered that and reintroduced this bizarre occult force, the gravitational force, that could happen instantaneously through a vacuum at arbitrary distance. That really puzzled it. So the point I'm making here is that, yes, matter seems to have the property of gravity or attracting. Okay, so that's fine. Can matter have the property of consciousness? Well, why not? Why couldn't it have the property of consciousness? Maybe it's just limitations on our imagination. We can't imagine why it would have that, but you know, evolution and nature are cleverer than we are. On the question of echo, so you want to?
Well, I'm just saying, yeah, sure, matter could have the property of consciousness. To me, that's pretty intelligible. I don't have trouble with the problem of imagining it because you just think of it as like a steam engine giving off steam, okay? Physical interaction gives off, you know, some vaporous thing you call consciousness. The problem is it doesn't do anything. It's functionally superfluous. And another way to see that is just look at the machines we design, the information processing systems, the software. Like, if you ask, is it like anything to be my computer? Does it feel like anything like be my computer? Well, if it does, it's a bonus, because we don't need that to explain why it does what it does. And as far down AI as you go, and we're starting to go pretty far, with facial recognition and all kinds of impressive artificial intelligence, it could be that it's like something to be one of these machines, or will be, but it certainly doesn't seem to be necessary because we can explain the behavior of these machines by just pointing to the physical flow of bits in the software. So that's the big problem, is that the one clearly intelligible form of dualism, which is called epiphenomenalism, that just consciousness, you just kind of give it off, that doesn't explain what consciousness would be for. That's my big problem. We don't need to turn this into a seminar on consciousness. Yeah. But my problem isn't the problem you have imagining it. It's like, there's two kinds of dualism. There's Descartes, where the consciousness is actually influencing the machine, and that just wreaks havoc with science. You're departing from a scientific point of view. And then there's epiphenomenalism, which is compatible with science, but then the question is, well, what is the consciousness for? That's the boundary.
Right. So I would quickly answer, why does it have to be for anything?
Well, it doesn't, but then that could lead you into the very kind of religious speculation you probably are also not enthusiastic about, because one thing that consciousness does do is give life meaning. It is the fact that we animals can feel pleasure and pain that gives life significance, right? I mean, if you heard of a planet where there were these beings that looked just like us, but they couldn't feel pleasure and pain, it wasn't like anything to be like them, and you said, is there anything wrong with blowing the planet up? You'd probably go, well, no. I mean, what's been really lost? What makes life meaningful, what gives moral questions their significance, is that people have experience, and animals presumably do. So, to say that there's actually no mechanical function, given that consciousness is what gives life meaning, I think leads into legitimate speculation about spiritual or religious questions that might make you uncomfortable.
So I would agree.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I would agree that consciousness gives life meaning and purpose. But if we go down that road, and if we grant the existence of, say, philosophical zombies, which would not be conscious, we would have the same impression. They would tell us that life has meaning, and they wouldn't be conscious. So I'm not sure that.
if they had been programmed to say life has meaning, I mean, we can program a computer to say my life has meaning, but we all know its life does not have meaning unless it can feel things.
Well, that's, yeah, okay.
Excuse me, this
Yeah.
gentleman has had his hand up.
Oh, sorry.
a long
All right, so
time.
to wrap that up, consciousness is weird. Slightly different views, but yeah, we'll take a few more questions. So, sir.
Wouldn't you grant, though, that consciousness is a prerequisite for making plans?
Well, it depends what you mean by consciousness. You can have a machine that makes plans and is not conscious.
No, you,
in the
you
sense,
can't.
Sure.
Right now, we don't have any artificial intelligence that's capable of recognizing that a problem exists.
Chess
that
playing
there is a
machine?
potential. No, a chess playing machine
They make all kinds of plans.
is a brute force machine that just takes every possible move and takes it to its conclusion.
You asked if machines could make plans. The answer is
That
yes.
is not a plan.
Of course it's a plan. Give me a definition of a plan by which it doesn't apply to the chess machine.
Okay, I recognize from years of experience
Okay.
that spring is going to come.
Okay,
Every year, spring is going to come.
right.
If I know this,
Uh-huh.
then I know that if I save some seeds
Uh-huh.
until next year, I can plant them. I can plan to have a garden, and I can plan through recognition of past history and from talking to other people who are conscious entities that corn is good, right? So corn is something I want to plant.
Sure.
Got to be conscious to do all of this stuff.
But see, I think there's a confusion here about what one means by conscious. You don't need qualia to do the things you describe. You need something else. Information processing will give you what you want, not qualia. So that's the distinction I think that we're trying to. What Robert is saying is that in addition to what you would get through information processing, which would give you planning and all kinds of stuff, there's something else. There's this very different first-person experience that we all have, right? That seems to do nothing, maybe, apart from doing everything, which is to give us the meaning of life and everything. But for what you describe, you don't need consciousness qualia. You need simply information processing.
So, next
Right.
question.
Yeah, so I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around this mindfulness thing. So you say like natural selection idea that we're not designed to see the world clearly. You talk about like Kahneman, System 1, and it sounds to me it's like we're irrational humans. But then you talk about our everyday perceptions as something like feeling and thought. I mean, those can be expressed with a propositional attitude. I feel this, I think this, I love this, I don't know what to love. But then I'm thinking, if you do meditation and all this stuff, and you achieve this like mindfulness, is this mindfulness like a mental event? Is it like what exactly is it? Is it kind of just like, I'm thinking of it as just like become rational? And if or exactly what is it a mental event? Is it just a state that describes your rationality of decision making? And then if what it is that it comes to, if you talk about doing a study, I mean, are there levels of mindfulness? Is it something you can measure how? I don't know exactly.
Okay, so, question maybe oversimplified. Could I elaborate on like what mindfulness is really like? What is this state of mindfulness like? What is it like? What does it feel like to be mindful, or?
I guess, I'm just like, is it like a mental event?
Well, it changes the nature of your experience. And again, I know this much more from being on retreat than I do from everyday life, sadly, because it's a hard thing to sustain in a really deep way. But it is. I mean, first of all, the word that was translated as mindfulness, sati, in Pali, could have been translated in other ways. It could have been translated as awareness, and a lot of it is that a kind of reflective awareness of things that normally you are at best dimly aware of. I mean, like when you are caught up in rage, for example. I mean, at one level you feel the rage, but the rage so quickly drives you to the thoughts it is intended to sponsor. Like, this person is a bad person. They deserve this. That you don't kind of pause and reflect on the rage. Whereas the more you do reflect on the rage, the more aware you are of the rage, the less likely you are to let it drive you to the thought. again, the idea here is that cognition is largely governed by affect. And the way we're built by natural selection is that, I mean, remember, feelings would have existed long before thoughts in evolutionary time, right? I mean, even bacteria, you see them approach things, avoid things, then they have feelings, right? The basic the original function of feeling seems to be to get you to approach things, to avoid things. Then as you go through evolutionary time, you have these thinking machines built on top of the system, but it's the feeling that's more fundamental. So, so the function of the feeling seems to be, to drive you to certain ways of looking at the world, certain ways of thinking about them. And as it happens, if you're more conscious of the feelings themselves, you're just less likely to let them control you and drive you to the cognitive point that they're kind of designed to drive you toward. And this gets a little bit to the illusion thing, the idea that we don't see things clearly. You take something like anxiety. There's a chapter in the book where I go through like what different feelings do, what they're designed to do, and also how some of them, in a sense, misfire in a modern environment, which is not the environment they were designed for. Road rage is a good example. Road rage is less likely to get you killed in a hunter-gatherer environment than rage at a perceived slight. So anxiety sponsors when you're in the grips of anxiety, you'll find yourself starting to really greatly overestimate the chances of some horrible thing happening. That's just an out-and-out illusion. Now, there's another way that therapists approach this problem, cognitive behavioral therapy, where they just address the thought itself. They say, no, wait a second, you worried about this? And you say, yeah. And they say, has this ever happened to you? Well, no. Do you know anybody it's happened to? Well, I read about somebody in Siberia once or something. It's like, and so they talk you down logically from the thought. Mindfulness addresses the illusion from that, in a sense, a more fundamental angle. It gets you to develop a relationship toward the feeling that sponsors the thought in a way that undermines the thought. So, the last thing I'd say, I gather from your expression that I'm not really directly answering your question. It's a hard thing to do, but I would say that there's a kind of irony in a mindful relationship to feelings, which is that in a certain sense, you're more detached from the feeling. You really are viewing it with more objectivity in a sense. It's in one sense like you're outside the system, and yet often you're more in touch with the feeling than you ordinarily are, precisely because you're inspecting it closely. It's like I said, it's like anxiety or something. Normally, it just drives you into the anxious thought. You don't pay that much attention to the anxiety itself, whereas if you are mindful, you really observe the structure of the feeling. You're in a certain sense more in touch with feelings because you're not, you're neither trying to escape, you're not trying to escape the bad feelings, and you're not trying to grasp the good feelings, and possess them. And so it's ironic that on the one hand, you are less in the grip of the feelings, you are less their slave, but you are in another sense, and that's because of a kind of objectivity, but in another sense you are in closer contact.
So I think that's a great place to end, actually. So both of these, so Julien, thank you. Julien will be around for a few minutes so you can come up and ask questions.
I'll be around.
Robert, thank you so much. So I just want to put this book up here. You can pre-order it,
You
right?
certainly can.
So please pre-order this book. So I think we had a great night. We heard from Robert about mindfulness and about Buddhism, but particularly in kind of a cognitive bias and seeing reality clearly sort of light. We heard from Julien about some resonances with the scientific revolution and Francis Bacon. We talked about reducing cognitive biases generally from mindfulness, which I think would be a great study. If anyone's interested in that, come up, because I think we should just do it. And then we took a turn into left field, which I was hoping we would go there, about the nature of consciousness and how some of these experiences related to mindfulness touch on some of these beliefs about consciousness and about qualia and the hard problem. And we just brought it back down to the applied level in terms of how mindfulness relates to cognition and affect and anxiety. So really, I said it would be an intellectual feast. I hope we provided it. And thank you so much for coming out. Really appreciate it.